The author theory. The author theory argues that a director of a film is the author of it in a literal sense and also a metaphorical sense. And what it's indicating is basically that depending on the amount of control a director has over all the various aspects of a film, it will ultimately become a reflection of their own visions. This theory first came about after François Truffaut, in an essay that analyzed certain tendencies in French cinema. He noticed that American directors, they had a lot of parameters that they had to keep by, and despite that, there were many American filmmakers who somehow managed to leave their own imprint. For example, the likes of Alfred Hitchcock or Orson Welles, they were well able to develop a very personal filmmaking style. This theory was then further proved by Jean-Luc Godard, and he showed the importance and relevancy that this theory played in displaying the imprint of a director in their works. So, what exactly makes an author? Well, the basic premise of that answer is recognizable and recurring themes and visual tropes that a director might consciously or even unconsciously want to include in a film. So as a result, a viewer may or may not be able to recognize these constant motifs and be able to associate that film with its appropriate director. These can all be spotted in the works of arguably one of the most recognizable authors of the 21st century, that is Wes Anderson. So one example of this is with how he explores a series of consistent themes in almost all his movies. So for example, in say the Royal Tenenbaums, The Life Aquatic, and even The Darjeeling Limited, we see him exploring themes about familial relationships, loss of innocence, thefts, disappearances, mystery hunts, and so on. But obviously, the most iconic feature about Wes Anderson movies that is directly associated to him himself is the amount of control that he has over the cinematography of the film and also the character design. Wes Anderson, he actually once really famously said that he wants to tell his stories from the perspective of a 12-year-old. We see this in how all of his movies, they tend to have like an almost storybook or like a dollhouse feel to it. In terms of cinematography, we can see the Wes Anderson-ness of it by how geometrically aligned, and he tends to reuse camera angles and camera movements that are meant for flat spaces, like for example this angle, or this, or this, or even this. Unlike most other directors, he tends to use very little dynamic movement in order to intensify the performance of his characters. In terms of the characters, and the children especially, the children tend to act like adults, and the adults tend to act like children. And we see this especially clearly in the likes of the Royal Tenenbaums. In some characters, we actually see them being almost a perfect reflection of Wes Anderson himself. And we see this especially in the character of Mr. Fox in Fantastic Mr. Fox. But something that I've realized when I was doing my research for this study is that the term author may perhaps be used in the wrong sense. Because at the core of it, a film is a collaboration of all sorts of creative talents. We don't only have the director, we also have the cinematographer, we have the scriptwriters, and we have the wardrobe designers, and an infinite amount of people who work together. And it's when these people, they work together, they somehow rather mix in their own elements, their own styles, and together all of them is what makes a good film. So even when it comes to the author theory or author directors, they also depend on all these other crew members in order to contribute to the final product. So in that sense, can it really be said that a director is the only person who can be considered an author? So at the end of it, I have personally come to the conclusion that term can also be shared with the likes of scriptwriters and cinematographers, set designers, and so on. Bye!